Welcome to the Fire These Times, the podcast bringing you conversations at the intersection of politics, culture, and the environment. I'm your host Joey Ayub, and today we'll be talking to Emmy Bevensey again. They are a data journalist who utilizes a data storytelling approach to make complexity understandable. So this is part 2 of our conversation, and I recommend listening to part 1 first. A couple of quick notes. There's a bit of audio issues at times, but nothing too annoying. I am going to invest in a better mic soon, so this should be a temporary thing. I would also briefly say that Emmy at some point uses the term Marxist or Marxist, and I realized that given the convo it can be confused with Marxist. These are not the same. Marxism refers to a specific phenomenon within Trotskyism that we briefly touched upon. It's not a major part of this conversation, but I just thought it important to make that distinction to avoid any confusion while listening. As with part 1, I will ask you to pause this for a sec and check out the categories listed in the description. This is how many things we get into, which is why I would also not even try to summarize this conversation, just as I haven't in part 1. So that's today's episode. This episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. If you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tara Beat. Thank you for listening and take care. Okay, this is gonna be a very weird transition that's not directly related, but I mentioned before that I had like 2 questions, and so that this is the second one. About entryism, I've been increasingly interested, even like having a morbid curiosity with this sort of like, I just call them like Thanos from Avengers, of like eco-fascism variety. And I remember reading, it was actually, I think it was an actual interview, like a video interview by the guy who plays Thanos, I forgot his name. And he said something along the lines of like, Thanos is a complicated character who, had good intentions, but was, I don't know what, I'm not gonna misquote him, but like something like that. And that in itself was enough to kind of trigger an alarm in my head. And I do understand where it comes from, and I don't think that people who are worried about very vague things that they tend not to really understand, like overpopulation or whatever, I do understand the almost claustrophobic feeling of feeling, you're in a finite planet, blah, blah, blah. I do get where it comes from, although with some of them, not all of them, there's the darker shit there. But I'll ask you about eco-fascism because I think you've studied it more than I have so far. I will preface this with this very brief story of, in end of 2019, in the middle of the protest movement, I was taking this workshop in Beirut. I was taking this workshop on like permaculture and sustainable economies and whatever. And within like 10 minutes of that workshop, someone brought up overpopulation in Africa. And there was no context. No one was talking about population in the first place. It was just in, resources and limit resources and whatever. And
because we all know that Africa is the continent who's really stealing resources.
Absolutely. And that was my response, obviously. And I mentioned, the disproportionate consumption of not just the richer nations, but then the richer people within those richer nations and the corporations, blah, blah, blah. Many people listening to this probably already know this. I'll try and dedicate an entire episode on this specific thing. But how would you understand and so, okay, that position that she said, I wouldn't describe it as necessarily eco-fascist, but like it flirts with it. It's like under the surface. It's very easy to then kind of make the jump and then become ideological if, she was influenced by someone else or whatever. But that misconception and misunderstanding of how resources actually are extracted in our world and the disproportionate impact of the usually smaller but richer nations and blah, 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 those things aren't well understood. And so I want to be a bit kinder to the people who engage in these things. But again, that's one, like a section of that tendency. Then you have the darker shit, and you have in between the naive ones and then the extremists, you have all of these things that are actually pretty mainstream. It's pretty mainstream to have concerns about overpopulation or whatever that is not actually based in any sound science or whatever it is, and not, you know what I'm talking about. So I'll just shut up now and give you the floor.
Yeah. Well, So yeah, I think the thing with ecofascism is this like depressing reality that we all mostly like whatever our communities are understand, broadly speaking, and recognize as existing. And it's like pretty hard for us to emotionally process, I think, as a species, because it's the quintessential example of a complex problem that transcends nationalism and sectarianism and everything. Because if we fuck it up, we all die. So maybe Elon Musk survives, but whatever. So so it's hard, it's like, even for me talking about it, it's hard, it's emotional. Um, and I think historically the right has fetishized nature, and sort of the syncretic fascist movements have syncretic, I just mean like crossover. Um, the sort of syncretic fascist movements have like fetishized nature and like, whiteness as being like ruler over nature and things like this. But have historically denied climate change. And the left tankies have done this to a degree too. Like, so there's some crossover there, but I would say it's more of a far right thing to do. It's like culturally more of a far right thing to deny climate change. However, you cannot deny climate change forever. And so eventually, if you're a fascist, you have to like wrap some sort of fascist ideology around the increasing reality of climate change. And you can do that a lot of ways. They do that a lot of ways. They say it's not human caused, but it exists. They say it exists, but it's caused by China. And then others are like, it exists, like the Atomwaffen accelerationist thing is like, it exists, but it's good because it'll destroy civilization and us strong white people will survive. I love this. I've always kind of found this idea kind of humorous, that like all these like basement dwelling alt-right edgelords are somehow going to survive the apocalypse and see this super, ubermensch society or whatever. But yeah, so there's like a lot of different angles that they can take it. But because like green movements are left broadly, they have to appropriate a lot of aesthetics and a lot of histories. So if you go in like eco-fascist Telegram chats, they will like post propaganda from the Earth Liberation Front or from Earth First, and they'll like claim that as their heritage. And obviously those are left organizations, but even those organizations, like I'll talk a little bit about Earth First, have some problematic history with this like ecofascism thing, because in the early days it was more of like, it was this populist thing of like, we're all united against civilization. It's a post-political kind of problem. And so they had like these quote unquote buckaroos who were like far right people who recognize climate change, but were like racist. And were anti-queer. So that's how you got into like the hardcore turfy Greens like Derek Jensen and Deep Green Resistance and stuff like that, who were like social conservatives who believed in climate change or whatever. And and now Derek Jensen is beloved by Andrew Anglin and Daily Stormer, because Andrew Anglin's like, I like this guy, he hates civilization and queers. We've got a lot in common. But Earth First, to its credit, was like, okay, this sucks. And they started organizing as a green organization against the Klan, for example. They started seeing, and they started developing more nuance about like environmental racism and stuff like that. The way that these issues proportionally are racialized, like it's not a post-political issue. It follows, with other analyses of power that we have. It's interconnected with all these things. So they started cutting people out. But now there is like an increasing movement of this kind of like green brown, I guess we could call it, thing.
When we talk about the media landscape, when we talk about how these fascist movements, how these far right ideologies, how they organize, I feel like part of the problem isn't just how like free speech is used and exploited by people on the far right. I think probably most listeners already know that this happens a lot. But the type of algorithms that I've grown very concerned with, and which is why like I dedicated a few episodes of talking about this and a few more to come this year on websites like YouTube and Facebook especially. Those are two websites that have gotten a lot of attention for the type of algorithms that they run, which tend to encourage, to put it very mildly, certain kind of extremist behaviors, because that is most likely to keep people online, which is the entire point.
I think that there are a lot of battles, and that the battles themselves aren't, just like I would say geopolitics is not like this binary two countries opposing each other. It's like all kinds of corporate and political and grassroots interests interacting as networks. There's also this dynamic in the battles that are happening about, like, let's just say this super empowered internet, harmful internet content. And so there's many different fronts of this conflict. Like one of the fronts that I'm interested in that is not quite that popular yet, or not that well understood yet, but I think is really important, is has to do with peer-to-peer technology, which is just like, the shortest way is just like a more decentralized model of computers communicating. People have heard of like Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer technology, but there's also like social medias and texting platforms and all kinds of stuff, server hosting. And as fascist and conspiracy websites, usually the order of events in my experience is they get kicked off of US infrastructure, and then they move to Russian infrastructure. And then if they get kicked off of Russian infrastructure, or it's too sketchy or unstable, then they start to entertain peer-to-peer technology. And it's kind of a last resort, because a lot of the technology is not as streamlined as they're used to. But it's way, way, way more resilient. And so, like, the infamous, obviously every fascist website now has like, you can donate in Bitcoin or Ethereum or more private coins like Monero or something. But groups like Atomwaffen and the Base also started using like peer-to-peer texting platforms. The Christchurch attackers manifesto kept getting taken down, so people started uploading it to IPFS, which is like this peer-to-peer file hosting system. And then, but the most famous example was the platform Gab, which is like this alt-right echo chamber social media free speech with big air quotes around it, platform. And they were connected to a mass shooting, and so they got booted from all their infrastructure. So they switched to Gab, or so they switched to this technology called Mastodon. And it's like, I'm not going to explain how servers work right now, but suffice to say, instead of having one big server that hosts your website, you have like a network of servers who work together to host your website. And you like host it as peers, as a community. And so they moved to this technology, and they've been running fine on it since. And so, you know, with Parler getting deplatformed, there was this question for a while of whether they'll move to Mastodon as well, which they might still. But there's also, it seems like they'll probably get hosted by Epic, which is like this alt-right white supremacist web hosting thing. And so the peer-to-peer thing is interesting to me because it takes a lot of the central issues of algorithms and censorship, free speech, and like puts it in a new domain that's much more complicated, and we're not used to it all. Like something that I do want people to understand is obviously we should hold Twitter accountable for platforming fascists. But I also want people to understand at the scale that Twitter exists, moderation is an extremely non-trivial problem. I'm not giving them a free pass. They don't do nearly enough, but like you can only do human moderation so much. And at a certain point, by the way, all that human moderation is going to be paying people to do like Amazon Turk kind of work in predominantly the global South to like view a lot of very harmful or traumatic content. So even if that's your solution, you're still outsourcing your trauma to like predominantly poor people. But if you want them to do machine learning, I'll give an example. Like the way that marginalized communities use a term and the way that the communities that hate them use a term are deeply contextual. So I don't want to get banned for using the word queer, but I also would think it was funny if like a fascist got banned for calling me a queer, because we have a very different usage. And machine learning can learn a lot about context, but it's not that good at context, like human context. And it gets even more complicated when you get into questions that different marginalized groups disagree on amongst themselves. And so in order to write a machine learning algorithm, you have to like create training data. In order to create that training data, you have to make rules for, you know, what is considered harmful content. Like I worked on this one project at my university, and they were studying like toxicity in communication online, and they were creating training data. And they were just studying like rude content or something like that, like mean content online. And I was trying to explain to them that calling someone an illegal as a noun is specifically a hate term that is not. And they were like, no, we're STEM bros, like that's a technical term. And I was like, you have no context of the communities that you're building algorithms for. And so now you're just going to kick me out of the project because I made everybody uncomfortable. And so that kind of shit is the reality of like, well, why don't they just create machine learning? They can. I mean, they put huge effort into, you know, machine learning ISIS content, but even that auto moderates like evidence of war crimes in Syria and starts just flagging Muslims doing things as like Al-Qaeda or whatever. So it's there's some hard problems there. And once we get into the peer-to-peer land, they're even harder because we can't do that. There is no central body that can just take something down. But what I like about the peer-to-peer side of it, I'm a huge peer-to-peer supporter, to be clear. Like I love the technology, but I mainly love it for us, you know. Like I love it for the exciting things it can do for us. Because our infrastructure we're going to get censored too. Like Twitter's going to take down all of us. Sex workers, queer sex workers, been knowing about, you know. And so like peer-to-peer technology kind of asks us to solve these problems ourselves rather than like outsourcing it to some central some central like body, like just trusting Twitter to decide our discourse for us and to protect us from traumatic content. Like peer-to-peer is more human because it's like, hey, you guys have to deal with this. maybe that's not the exact answer you wanted, but it's like that's kind of where I'm thinking about those questions the most right now.
No, I mean, thanks for that. It's, as I said, like it's still very much a like unresolved issue in my mind as well. I don't really have the answer for it. I joked, before, like, just delete Facebook. And obviously, I mean, if people can do that, just do that. I do know that many people, I mean, I'm reluctantly on Twitter. I don't want to be on Twitter. I kind of still have to use it for my work, and it's just not easy. There's a network effect that is just reality. But like, put it kind of on a related note, actually, like on this sort of disinformation, the algorithms that I mentioned that are worth talking about, but they're not the entire story here. Can you talk a bit about the social media analysis toolkit? You mentioned, like, before we started recording, that like a lot more people are paying attention to it now, obviously due to the attempted coup in DC and whatever. Talk about just like, what is it? How can people, let's say you're just pitching it to listeners, like how can they actually use it? And what is, like, from your view, the ideology behind it?
Yeah. Okay. So a long time ago, I started beefing with 8chan, and I came up with this idea that I was going to write some scrapers to like scrape all the data from 8chan and then do some analysis of it and make data viz. And that kind of sent me down a really long road because I started realizing all these researchers have like these tools, these code things that they can use to analyze social media and like especially do it fast, like because information warfare happens so quickly that we have to be able to react. But most of the people who I was most interested in working with, like activists and journalists or anti-fascist researchers or things like this, didn't have the technical capacity to like run all these complex code pipelines and stuff. And so I started thinking about how could we make it easier for people to visualize trends on across a bunch of different social media platforms so that we can answer questions kind of as they're happening. And so I started building these tools, and then a co-op kind of sprung up around me, and we started building all this stuff. And then we built this thing called SMAT app, smat-app.com. And it's like an easy, free, no sign up. You just jump right in interface for, looking up like, oh, what links are people sharing with QAnon on 8chan or Twitter or Reddit or whatever. And, or like, when did Stop the Steal become really popular? It's also interesting for noticing some things happening, like, oh, this happened first on 4chan. We see it a day before it hit on Reddit or whatever. And so we were working on this with a lot of people, and we worked on it also with people in Mexico doing different cool projects. And we were kind of chugging along, and we started indexing Parler. We have like a ton of data sources that we started indexing. Parler, 8kun, Gab. We have Reddit and Twitter verified feed, but those aren't ours. So then the coup happened, and all of a sudden, and then Parler went down, and all of a sudden, like every journalist was like, who has Parler data? And everybody was like, Emmy. Emmy and Emmy's friends have Parler data. And so like I went from this like really niche nerd to like fielding like 12 mainstream media requests in a day or whatever, and doing all these interviews and stuff. And there was this heroic effort by some other people to archive all of Parler before it went down, because you can see in our Parler data, people just openly organizing. I don't know what it is about the right and committing felonies on live stream, but they just love it. And on social media, they're just all about that, like, self-incrimination life. And Baked Alaska, this alt-right fashy brawler dude, just live streaming, breaking shit in Nancy Pelosi's office, now has a warrant for his arrest. I mean, that's kind of on you, bro. Yeah, so we built all these tools, but they're free, you know, and we give away our data for free, and we work with journalists and activists and stuff. And there's a lot of different ways that you can use the tools. But basically, my ideology going into this is like, social media platforms, intelligence agencies, police, corporations, they have really, really powerful analytics tools that they use for really sketchy things. And my belief was that we need to give way more people access to tools for making sense of our online conversations, as a means of kind of overcoming these information warfare things that we've been discussing a lot. Because, like, for example, one time I've run a bunch of OSINT trainings, and like I usually teach SMAT when we run them, as one of the things. And I one time had this person who's Kurdish in the training, and is interested in like Syria OPCW stuff. And she started, she started researching like these OPCW and chemical weapons questions using SMAT, and started finding some really interesting things. And that's kind of the heart of what I'm into about it, is like, it's kind of like my ideological framework that we need more people working on problems rather than like some elite vanguard, whether it's the CIA or the like tanky vanguard. It's not I don't believe that's how problems get solved, much less extremely complex ones. So what excited me about this is like, people have interests and expertise. This person knows a lot about, geopolitics in her country and her regions, that I don't know about. So she can investigate these specific questions. Or like the Mexican researchers that I worked with are like, doing all this stuff about Mexican politics that I don't even know about. So that was my goal, is just to get more people able to do this kind of research. But then all of a sudden we were the only ones with all this far right data. So
honestly, I one of my biggest regrets is not being able to do something similar when it comes to archiving in Lebanon, or at least data collection. When it comes to, there are some people who have done interesting things, but I think it's largely at like small or small-ish levels. The sort of things I mentioned before on, like, the pro-Assad shit that I started seeing really expanding very quickly on Facebook, I'm almost certain that there was a government hand behind a lot of them. And I know that obviously this became a bit more well known with Cambridge Analytica and the Brexit shit and whatever. But I think when it comes to Syria, there was some pretty significant early influences that I'm sure maybe other people have already done that research. But it's just one of those things that when it was happening, I wish I knew how to just collect the evidence, essentially.
One thing I will just pitch for
Yeah.
on your show is for people to get the browser add-ons for archive.org and for archive.today. It makes it so that when you find a web page, you just click this button and then it'll archive it. It makes it really useful for researchers later who are like, damn, this web page is down. Let me check if there's an archive. Boom, somebody archived it,
Oh, so they basically use the add-on and it adds it to the website itself.
Yeah, you can. Well, so archive.org, you can just go there and archive any web page,
Yeah.
or archive.today. But the browser add-ons just make it way easier because you just have to press a button. But like researchers, like, so I did a 3-part series on red-brown media ecosystems where I looked at like the far right side of the spectrum, and then the like pure kind of red-brown side, and then the like left-leaning side. And for that research, like having archives was extremely necessary because these actors are so sketchy that they're constantly deleting things, and changing their story and this and that. So having like these archived proofs was really, really helpful.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so I have 3 somewhat related questions, but not fully related questions. Are you ready for them?
Bring it on.
Okay, so I'll start with something that I know we have in common, like our with our difficult relationship with even like the term leftism,
Mhm.
in the sense that sometimes it feels, and this is not a fully developed thought. I know that there are such things as like the post-left, and I know obviously that anarchism is sort of there, but not really there, and there are complicating things happening there. I know that. So I do sometimes wonder if like the binaries that were largely created in like the 19th century, in like a post-industrial revolution thing, like if they're still valid all the time in today's context, especially with the internet and especially with probably increasingly so with global warming. And I say this while recognizing that there are like there are existing frameworks that are useful. I'm not saying I don't want to throw like the baby out with the bathwater. But one of my earliest experiences of disillusionment with quote unquote the left, other than the Syria stuff that I've already talked about a lot, which I think is an obvious example, and I can also cite Ukraine on that and Hong Kong more recently. Um, Other than that, is kind of just going through a bit of the history of indigenous movements in China or in Soviet Union and in parts of Latin America. And whereas in Latin America, this was, I think it's more well known with people on the left because the governments that tended to do the horrible shit tended to be, backed by the Americans and whatever. So like right wing and militaristic and whatever. But the stuff that the Soviet Union used to do and the Chinese government used to do and still is doing, um, those to me sort of the fact that there isn't a existing framework that is as clear as, for example, people that oppose Israel because they support Palestinian rights or whatever. This is like very clear on the left. It's like it's very easy to be pro-Palestine pretty much if you're on the left. Well, in America I know it's more difficult, but like generally speaking. But then you speak about Xinjiang and Hong Kong and Belarus or whatever, and then it becomes quote unquote more complicated. And it's those things that for me are not complicated. They're actually just as straightforward as the Palestine stuff. That you know the experience of indigenous communities in these countries, and even more recently, like Latin American government that are leftist quote unquote, have like quite a lot of weird, not weird, but like like dark stuff on their hands as well. I don't know, like I still struggle with these terms, and so I wanted to just throw it at you in some ways, not to just solve, not to solve my existential crisis necessarily, but to talk about the fact that it's not as clear, these things that are supposed to be clear. Like I've had so many conversations with people that are Marxists or some anarchists as well, that kind of talk about what I've been calling alt imperialism as almost like the exception, like, oh well, it's just this weird thing and it happens a lot for some reason, but it's always an exception. And it does get to the point where like at what point are the exceptions no longer the exceptions? And I know people that have actively stopped calling themselves leftists even though they have progressive views due to these things. And so I'm just throwing it out there, and do with that what you would.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of parts. Definitely, like a lot of indigenous movements that I've taken inspiration from don't necessarily identify with the left because it's like founded on like these these white European views that are younger. There's actually a really good video that exists right now. It's called like, I think it's called Playing Indian or something like that. And it's about how most European theory was appropriated by from from really weird indigenous contexts, like from these creepy anthropologists who fetishized like Iroquois Federation and stuff like that.
Playing Indian and the Roots of Collectivism.
Yep, that's the one.
Yeah, I just found it.
And how like that those weird contacts that were deeply misunderstandings became very formative in a lot of the early Marxist theory and anarchist theory as well. Meanwhile, the Quakers were just kind of like actually chilling with indigenous people and like trying to, not that they're perfect, but just like trying to develop relationships rather than doing this weird thing that white leftists did for a long time. So, I mean, even that's kind of a good example in and of itself. Like from the beginning, like the Quakers were like trying to build relationships and interact respectfully with sovereignty. Meanwhile, these leftists were like trying to get clout kind of through appropriation. And so that's as old as European, leftist history. And but that all being said, I think for me, the left is an entirely incoherent term. I use it as a shorthand for Twitter just because it's very few characters. But like, but I don't have any values in common with a lot of people who consider themselves, or I have very minimal values in common with a lot of people who consider themselves leftists. Like, and this is the kind of standard post-left, this is one of the standard post-left critiques, is like there is no shared value system across the left. And so a lot of people who would consider themselves leftists, I mean, I try not to have enemies, but would be my enemies. Like if it came down to it, I would be really actively opposed to them. And tankies are among those. Like I would absolutely oppose central economic planning by a Vanguard committee. I would oppose it with everything that I could oppose it with because it sucks. It sucks mathematically. It sucks humanly. It sucks politically. So to me, that's not even. Well, you get into stupid, boring semantic debates because you're like, is Stalinism even in the left? Or is authoritarianism in the right? And then you're like, oh man, I'm fucking up the political quadrants so bad. So like, I probably am a post-leftist, but the post-left sucks. Historically, they're really cringy. But yeah, I guess I would like to believe in some kind of like left internationalism, some kind of heart of these things that could be good. But I recognize that it's like such a watered down terms that there's pretty much a guarantee that me and the person I'm talking to are going to be missing each other in fundamental ways just because we have different connotations, even if we're like similar in groups or whatever. So yeah, I try to be more clear about like specific values or specific issues than like specific political teams, just because also like the right talks a lot of bullshit about virtue signaling on the left. And then they take it to this weird way of vice signaling and being like, it's cool that I'm a shitbag. but like there is a ton of virtue signaling bullshit like on the left. People who just see it as a social capital sphere to like build influence and build little micro cults and so like and the left is really vulnerable to that because we're like care about people or something something stupid like that and so like yeah so there are all these little like tyrannical kind of things that are just like, and I think a lot of the weird geopolitics stuff looks like that. And the thing that I think makes it work is because it's easy. Like a geopolitic, so for people who are just getting into this stuff, the tanky view is like, look, we want to help the workers of the world against the bourgeoisie, and all you have to do is be a Marxist. And they're like, whoa, what does that mean? Well, it means that the US is the ultimate enemy. So anyone who's like vaguely opposed to the US, even if they're like Assad was like deeply working with the CIA in all these ways, and Israel, like even if they're all that stuff exists, as long as they say they're kind of anti-US, then you have to support them 100%. You can't say anything bad about them, or you're literally in the CIA yourself. And even that is like, they wouldn't call it Marxism because that's like a Trotsky thing, but that's what it like historically is. But that ideology is so simple. It's really easy to get people behind a political program. Like this is the point of our complexity thing, is like, it's actually really hard to sell complexity as a political program because it's hard to explain. It's like, I'm not going to tell you what you need to think about this geopolitical issue. I'm going to just tell you that it's going to be complex, and you should look for those tensions, and you should look for the way that those tensions move and change. And it's not easy for people to join a community like that, because the way you join a community is you come in, you learn the language, you virtue signal, you get cool points, you make friends, whatever. And I realize it's asking a lot of people to think like that. And I think that some of these people give a simpler version that's easier to sell.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, to be honest. Let's just say I'm slowly getting into it a bit more, and so this is probably going to be reflected in the podcast, probably, I don't know. But my concern over global warming, other than it's horrible and we need to do something about it, which is obvious, is that it also just accelerates a lot of the things that if there was no climate change, and if there was no immediate existential threat, especially in stuff like that, I could see things like the way people react to refugees and migrants. I'm a migrant in Europe. I can see that as well. It's going to take some time to whatever. Usually what happens is that you would have like a percentage of those refugees that are quote unquote better integrated. They do something amazing for the society, like those Turkish Germans that discovered the vaccine in Germany, whatever. And then suddenly you have a lot of think pieces and stuff about how it's good to integrate refugees and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I could see that process happening, and usually like it takes a generation or 2 generations or whatever. And I can rationalize it that way. I don't like that it takes so long, but whatever. I can rationalize it. And, when I weigh the pros and cons, it doesn't figure in my top 10 lists of things to be as concerned about, let's say. But then you have climate change, obviously, and it accelerates that. It's no longer, you might have 1 million refugees on your shores over a period of whatever. Now we're talking about tens of millions now, or whatever it is. And for me, this requires a way of thinking that doesn't, in order to respond to that potential crisis or whatever, it requires a way of thinking that doesn't just follow, like, in the UK, like as far as I can tell, the position of most British leftists is we get Jeremy Corbyn in and he'll be nice to refugees. Like I feel like that was the only as good as it got, even though like he, okay, I'm not gonna get into that. I'm so not gonna get into that. But like, it's like I can go so far, essentially. I can rationalize certain things, not because I like them, but because I was like, well, okay, Biden getting in better than Trump getting in. Doesn't mean I'm happy that there's Biden in, but at least I don't have to now worry about Trump getting in. It becomes a calculation, essentially. It's just of like harm reduction. And that usually takes it. There's a time component to it. It usually takes some time for the effects of a certain whatever to be implemented. But this is being accelerated now, obviously, due to climate change, kind of like it's the stressor, essentially. I will also say that in a couple of days, I'm recording an episode with a couple of authors or co-authors of a study. I think there were more than two of them. Of it's a proposal for a societal transformation of how to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, essentially, of warming. So I'll just plug that briefly. One thing that it is actually related. So like this is the second of the third questions of the three questions, which doesn't include the book recommendation. So I'm cheating on that. The problem of scale is something that you understand much better than I do. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, which is super complicated and super difficult. There's a lot of maths involved. Two guests I had on recently, a few weeks ago, Martin Parker and Thomas Swan. They co-edited this book called, I have it in front of me, Anarchism, Organization and Management, Critical Perspective for Students. So like it's a specific book. It's actually for business students, which is provocative and interesting. And they made the case rather convincingly, in my opinion, that anarchists need to be learning from like some of the technical skills, let's say, not all of them, obviously, that are sometimes taught in business schools. And the idea isn't just that because their audience are not anarchists, their audience are business students. So the idea is actually to do it the other way around as well, and to show that you can actually have organizations or whatever that are not top down. You can have a decentered way of doing things, a non-hierarchical way of doing things. And it's pretty interesting. It has some flaws, it has some limitations, as do all books and whatever. But based on some of the reactions to this from other people, who describe themselves as left-wing or anarchists or whatever, I noticed that it is basically taboo to even suggest that those working quote unquote within capitalism, as if it's a choice for most people in the first place, that they have nothing good to offer. Like there's nothing, like the only good thing that we can do is, if a bit more extreme about it, like you can only read Marx and Engels and Lenin or whatever, and that's as good as it gets. And maybe you might include some things that happened in the 60s and 70s, but basically there's nothing good happening now. And for me, that's a very cynical take in things. I kind of, like it's a bit of a caricature, but this tendency does exist. And there are some people within the system, there are even some people that work in like, companies and marketing firms and whatever, they have some things to say. Like, I think most things that they have to say are not interesting and probably not valid, and maybe some of them are harmful, but it doesn't mean that it's a 100% thing. And occasionally it does happen to be the case that because they are relatively comfortable or they're relatively whatever, they have some time to think about certain things, and they may stumble upon a good idea that could be useful to people that are anti-authoritarian and not, want to have this non-hierarchical way of doing things or whatever. And I think the pandemic has highlighted so many of the flaws of modern societies, and I'm putting this super broadly. I don't know, I'm losing myself in my thoughts a bit, but can you talk a bit about, I know that you mentioned a piece that is not easy to read. I should say I've read it. I understood a bunch of it, so I'm proud of myself that I can understand some of the math stuff, although not as much as I want to. But can you talk a bit about that piece? Mention the website as well, because people probably don't know it, and like some of the arguments that you made there and why.
Yeah, so probably my most unpopular affiliations on the left are that I've written and worked a lot with this website called C4SS, the Center for Stateless Society, and they're unpopular because they're not very sectarian about ideas. They're like very nerdy and curious, so they'll entertain a lot of ideas as long as they're not like fascist. They're an anti-capitalist website, anti-authoritarian, but they'll like deal with old capitalist works like Hayek and stuff like that, and ask questions about like, well, how does this relate to our modern understanding of information theory and stuff like that? Is this true? How does this affect our social forms? And to me, those questions are really exciting. Like, I used to be a very kind of red anti-left, or very red leftist. But I started having like some nagging doubts about the program that we were all supposed to get behind. And so I started reading some like heretical literature, and I I'm more nerdy than I am caring about my social status. And so I went through some transformations there. But one of my transformations is that I became really interested in mutualism, which was the part that was important to me was that like people conflate the existence of exchange with mediums of exchange like a currency with capitalism as it exists. And what I began to realize was that economic coordination is an extremely difficult project. And lots of fascists and like far right people harp on the problems inherent to like central planning and communism. And so, like Mises's mentor was like this fascist Austrian dude, and Hayek supported Pinochet, like all these horrible things. However, they weren't 100% wrong about the existence of coordination problems. And this has been borne out by problems in the Soviet Union, but also just like in society. Like coordination problems are a whole field of math and computation. And they're just hard. They're just really hard. And so the idea that we can just like make the people's Walmart or the people's Amazon.com and just like produce and deliver everything that a society needs using machine learning or whatever else, it's not real. It's not a thing.
Yeah.
Like there's an extent that we can do that. Computationally, there is an extent that we can do that. And even pre-computationally, like Iroquois longhouse systems through matriarchal lineages were pretty good at at a small local level, coordinating by need the different things that people brought in and using complex social systems for managing the commons. Like people have been managing common pool resource problems for thousands of years prior to colonization. So like the tragedy of the commons is largely disproved to an extent. But once we get into scale, it becomes much more complicated. There's like this person, Elinor Ostrom, and she is the one who's credited with disproving the tragedy of the commons. But she just disproved it by saying that indigenous people have had solutions to these problems for a long time. But her work doesn't tackle climate change really, or something that big. And so yeah, I started getting interested in like, are there so markets are like this really taboo topic because capitalism is horrible. But what I realized is that like most market socialist models of coordinating economics rely on like replicating price systems in some way, because what price systems do is they prove preferences. Like our preferences are so complex that if I tried to tell you all my preferences, it would take a fucking long time. But also I would be wrong. like my revealed preferences would be different. Like the way I explain revealed versus stated preference is like maybe on your Netflix, you're like, ooh, I'm going to watch 5 documentaries about all these interesting things. That's your stated preference. And then your revealed preference is that you like watched Adventure Time for like 8 hours. So like our revealed, it's hard to get at revealed preference without some sort of exchange mechanism. And it's especially hard to scale those complex problems. And so I started asking a lot of questions about like, are there ways to create equitable systems that can still solve complex problems at scale? And that's kind of what C4, I ran a mutual exchange at C4SS with a lot of people from across different political spectrums, anti-authoritarian political spectrums. Like there was one person arguing that you could do cybernetic communism. I was obviously arguing against that. Some people were, we're all across the spectrum on that issue, but that's kind of how we liked to do it is get those dissenting views.
Well, there was so it's kind of it's a funny, pointless story, but I at some point, for some very random reason, I started reading just a lot of John Maynard Keynes' own writing. I just went into this mood really, and had lots of wrong things. But I'm not comfortable saying that he was a hack, which I've seen some people on the left say, as if like it's just Keynes on one side and Marx on the other, and they're in the ring and they're fighting it out or whatever. And this just to say, and it's such a boring point that I'm even annoyed in making it. But sometimes you should be reading people that you don't like, and you need to do that. It's really important, even the bad ones, not because you will agree with them. And I am absolutely not. See, I'm really annoyed right now, but I'm absolutely not saying that, oh well, if they have a different opinion, therefore we must all listen to different opinions, and therefore all opinions are valid. And no, I'm absolutely not saying that. Just see how this can go to different extents. Because I don't know how people listening to this, if they don't know me, like where they can go. It's so easy. But anyway, so I read these things because there's something that happens in my mind that I just noticed over time, and maybe you can relate to this, maybe not. But I would read things that I know would be provocatively, like that would just provoke some thought in me. Usually, even if it is like like it provokes sort of like a negative reaction. Like I would read something to actually oppose it in my mind, but because I would then be opposing it from a different angle, that gives me a different pathway towards something completely random. So like they could be arguing for something really shit, but they are doing so from a different standpoint that I'm not familiar with. And so I would then familiarize myself with that standpoint. And you can't get that if all you're fucking reading is Marx. Like, no offense to Karl Marx, like honestly, lots of interesting stuff, very smart dude, like really no doubt about that. But there's just more than that. It's just so much more than that. And there was so much more before. So that's something related to what you said before. There is a tendency, there are lots of Marxists, and again, I have Marxist friends, whatever, it's nothing personal, that tend to kind of start like, it started with Marx and then better things came after. So like they would say, feminism came after or whatever, and therefore it kind of nuanced Marx analysis and improved it and even contradicted some of it, but he's kind of like the founding father in that myth. And what that tends to do is just erase everything that came before Marx, as if there was simply nothing that came before that. Like nothing, there's no history before the 19th century. And for me, that's, obviously very problematic. And I don't even know where I'm going with this, I'm sorry. But I got to the point where I would read things that are quote unquote mainstream. So I was reading, I forgot his name. The guy who wrote Utopia for Realists and Humankind, Rutger or something. He's Dutch. I'm sure people know him and you can Google it. And I was reading his book that I know this for a fact, that if I positively reviewed it on Twitter, like today, I would get negative feedback, like just right now. even though like I think 80% or 90% of the things that are mentioned in that book are pretty straightforward, basic things. And that's actually one of the critiques of the book, that it could have gone further than that. But it's the kind of books that I think I have a point with this, but it's the kind of book that says things like, well, the tragedy of the commons is wrong, and here's why. The whole bystander effect is wrong. Here's why. The Stanford prison experiment was basically a hoax, and here's why, etc., etc. And all are valid points and all are good points, but they actually need to be said, and because a lot of people take these things for granted. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I read these books because occasionally there will be some things that I actually didn't think about. I did not know that the Stanford prison experiment was a fucking hoax. I had no idea. I then Googled it and I read about it and I was like, yeah, it's a total fraud, completely dishonest scientific experiment. And I didn't know that people in psychology class right now also know that there are some issues with it, but it's still being taught in some classes. So I wouldn't know this if I had not read this book that would not be in my, leftist reading group, which I don't even have one. But if I was in one, it wouldn't be in it. It's just not the kinds of things that we would be reading. And, that's sort of where I was going with this. And you have yourself started, or I don't know if you started, but you were part of a what do you call it, like a collective or whatever, on the topic of like emotional anarchism. And so I'm just gonna let you explain it, but I'll just shut up now. Explain a bit about what is emotional anarchism, why did you get into it, and I'll add something. I wanted to say something, but I'll add it later.
Well, just responding to what you were talking about before, I feel like the heart of what I resonated in what you were saying was like, there's a question with people of like, if there was a book that would completely change your core beliefs, would you read it? If it was pretty much guaranteed to change your core beliefs, would you read it? And people are kind of divided on this question. And like, I fall on the side of, I would absolutely read it. I would be too curious not to. Like, what is the argument that exists that could change my core beliefs? Are you kidding me? That's and so like, I mean, I read straight up fascist literature. I've read a lot of fascist literature. I'm not advocating that, but it's part of the reason why I have a high tolerance. And in reading fascist literature, I was even open to it. I was like, this is going to sound so bad. I'm going to get so wrecked for this. But I was like, if this makes me a fascist, then okay, so be it. I'll become fascist, I guess. I'm going to read this fucking book. But what happened was, it just deepened and complexified my resistance to fascism. I was like, I learned more about like what parts of me could be drawn to this, and therefore what is drawing other people. Like, what is, if anything, appealing about this to me, and how can I use that as like mimetic immunities to help other people get out of this? And so like, a lot of the literature that I've read, not just fascist literature, but just weird stuff, just really challenges my worldview. But like you said, I think it takes me on new, surprising angles. Like, I trust myself to still have values, basically, and to have my values like deepened by reading things that I'm not supposed to read or whatever.
Okay, so just let's just pin this for a sec before getting into emotional anarchism, because I think it's an interesting topic in itself. That I think that you said it in the end, that's the main thing that I feel now that I look back in my early 20s. I'm 29 now, but like, let's say in the past decade, I remember in my early 20s like actively not reading certain things that I knew, maybe psychologically, like maybe subconsciously, I mean, um, would make me uncomfortable.
Mhm.
And so one very obvious example, obvious now, is that I didn't read anything that had even remotely a, this is gonna sound weird, like a Zionist connotation. And
Mhm.
for a Lebanese, it doesn't sound weird, but for a Western audience, it might sound weird. I don't know. But
Understood.
yeah, you know, I didn't. So I didn't read anyone who's pretty much. I basically boycotted Israelis. Just that. I didn't know anything about them. It didn't matter pretty much at the time. And this was justified. I mean, it was at the time. In my mind, it was justified by what the Israeli government does, and you know, this is part of BDS. Even some people would argue and whatever. I'm not going to get into that debate because I feel it's too complicated for now. And I do have an episode, but it's not confirmed yet. So I'm not going to say too much about it yet. Um, and I also have to be super careful because I'm Lebanese and, you know, there are repercussions there. But when I did start reading it, I read actual Zionist literature, like actual history. And I did my master's at SOAS on Yiddish politics and Hebrew politics. And I had a conversation with Molly Crabapple on it on this podcast. So like it's on record anyway. That actually made me more convinced of why we need to move towards something that resembles either like a, I'm not going to say one state solution because I hate states, but something better than what exists right now that involves more of a parity between Jews and Palestinians in Israel, Palestine, or whatever it would be called. And this did not in any way negate the fact that my own grandfather is from Haifa and became a, you know, fled the Nakba and whatever. It didn't negate it whatsoever. It just complicated it. And complicating is not negation. And this is something that I feel mature saying it. It took me a while to recognize that if I'm complicating something, it doesn't mean I'm approving it, and it doesn't mean I like it. In fact, I think I'm opposing it more efficiently now. I feel like I'm not
It,
in Lebanon. There was this big thing at the time, and I'll stop on this, and I don't want to make random enemies. But there was this big thing at the time of focusing a bit too much, in my opinion, on the movie Wonder Woman that was being shown in the theaters because the main actress served in the IDF and whatever. And my issue with that wasn't that, like, I don't give a shit if people don't watch a movie, like that's your prerogative. My issue was more the government censorship. They were asking the government to remove it, so that was my issue with it. And my other issue with it is where do we then, what do we do with like Americans that serve in the American army and whatever, because those are fine and no one ever boycotts those. And you know, all of this to say that my issue with that at the time, which I didn't really understand until a bit later, wasn't the movie, wasn't the cause, wasn't BDS, even wasn't any of this, but was just a concern for energy, like how much energy I was spending into one thing, because it's all limited and we need to be doing other things that are more urgent. And
yeah.
that was my concern. And I got quite a lot of heat for that actually at the time. And so, yeah, I'll just shut up on that and ask you to comment on just like what is emotional anarchism, and what one thing
Yeah.
that I did like about it, and now I will really shut up, is that you don't actually need to be an anarchist, for example, to find that useful, which is what I mean. I don't know if most listeners would identify as anarchists, but you know, whatever.
I look, I don't even know if I identify as an anarchist. I just find it as a useful ethical and political framework for thinking about goals. And like basically it's like, to me it's just like the basic statement that our freedom is interdependent, and you know, I can't be free without you being free, and that we should try to maximize our interdependent freedom. That's that's just like a framework for me, and that's why I like anarchism and anarchist theory and anarchist communities. But it's like it's not a static thing in my mind, so I don't really care if people identify it. Lots of dickheads identify as anarchists, and you know, whatever.
Yeah.
So but yeah, the Emotional Anarchism Project was basically the statement that feeling like our interpersonal work is a domain where we can be maximizing freedom, and it like, even in a utilitarian way, it impacts our social movements. Like anybody who's been around has watched many different movements get like completely destroyed by like sexual abuse usually, and like cover-ups and stuff like that. And or has seen like women, like femmes and queers, doing a lot of emotional labor in the spaces and getting no credit for that. And like, only someone on the front line who fights is like most militant, and just kind of invisibilizing all the other work that goes into making community spaces work at all. And so, yeah, that was our basic idea. I started writing a lot of stuff. I was like, when I started the project, I was probably coming out of like a really deep depression for a while. And so I was really interested in all these different projects where people were trying to build autonomy over mental and emotional health, but also over like medicines and stuff. Like we were talking to a lot of groups that were like trying to homebrew hormones to like help trans women escape the like kind of crushing bureaucratic pharmaceutical like pipeline, and a lot of different stuff like that. And so we just started thinking about emotional issues through these lenses of like anarchist analysis, and like one of our early premises that we came to is like self-help sucks because it ignores structural politics, and it's like a form of gaslighting and victim blaming. It's like you can meditate all you want, but if like cops are shooting you, then an SSRI is only going to help so much. So there's like this structural side, but then there's also like this side to which our emotional and interpersonal work really influences not just how effective we are as communities of troublemakers or whatever, but also like how much joy we can bring into our spaces. Like, so we have a whole book written. There's a blog, but there's much more essays in the book, and we just haven't found the right publisher yet. So hit me up if you know a good publisher, anyone. But but there's some other, like there's an essay in the book that's about it's about these activists, is kind of a weird word, but for lack of a better word, these activists that I know who like love joy and fun and are very militant and do a lot of amazing stuff, but like also really just do so much fun stuff for our community. And so we like interview them about like what joy means to their organizing models and stuff like that. So it's not just about like, we interview like peer support groups dealing with like mental health and substance abuse stuff, but we also talk to people about like this really fun side of things as well.
Awesome. So I know that you have an essay. We don't have much time to get into it, I think, but you have an essay called "Open Borders Are Our Only Hope." I will basically just plug it in and ask people to read it. I think that's faster. But to sort of wrap up the conversation, I wanted to ask you, this thing I've been doing, like 3 books that you would recommend to listeners, and feel free to explain why. And you can just cheat and have more than 3 books if you want. Doesn't matter. Just for the fun of it.
Okay. Well, the first one that I was going to suggest is this book, Desktop Regulatory State, by Kevin Carson. It sounds boring, but it was really influential in this generation of me and my friends trying to think about complexity theory for the left. It's basically about like the emergence of these kind of more networked social movements. And the book that I'm reading right now is called Ministry of the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. And it's about climate change, so it's pretty intense, but it's really, really good. There's some really satisfying stuff in it, and really interesting as well. I feel like I'm learning, so I'm appreciating it. And I just want to like give a general pitch for like Afrofuturism and Afro solar punk futurism, which are like, because it's not my place to expound on these genres too much, but what I will say is there's this aspect of, it's just so deeply brave and radical to me to believe in a future when you've experienced massive marginalization and oppression. And so like when you get into books like by Octavia Butler, like The Parable of the Sower, she's explicitly believing in, you know, not just a future for like that Black people exist in the future as people say, but also that there are things to believe in and things to hope for and things that are worth fighting for, which, to generalize, you don't always get from the like hard sci-fi white dude authors. Generally you don't. You get this like hero kind of savior situation. And Afro solar punk is like emerging, and it's fucking cool. It's like, let's envision really beautiful futures as well. And then I did have a fourth thing, but it's not really a book. So, but in my mind, the most comprehensive sci-fi that exists is the player's handbook for an RPG called Eclipse Phase.
Okay, you're gonna have to explain that one.
So I don't like games, generally speaking. I'm a very weird person. I don't like RPGs. I don't like video games. I don't even like board games that much. But there is this RPG called Eclipse Phase, and it's about like a sci-fi future where humanity's kind of fallen to these AIs, and there's all these political factions and geopolitics, but it's just like so well fleshed out and so politically interesting that it was really fun for me. At least I've played a game of it. So me and my friends joke that it's the only theory that we read.
All right, well, awesome. I mean, this has been a fascinating chat. It went longer than I originally planned, but it doesn't matter. Thanks a lot for your time, and I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Yeah, and it's super nice meeting you.
You too.
Yeah, stay in touch.
Bye.
Bye.
The Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.